welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV Crime Fiction Edition. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Marcia Clark. Now that's a name that everybody knows. Whether you were watching the trial of the century, as the media dubbed the OJ Simpson murder trial, or the American Crime Story, where Sarah Paulson took home the Primetime Emmy, Golden Globe, and Screen Actors Guild Award for Outstanding Performance by a Female Actor in a Miniseries or Television Movie. What you might not know is that she's been a best-selling crime fiction author for the past 30 years and 3 decades, since that trial of the century wrapped, and first began a writing sojourn, capturing a real-life portrait of the whirlwind she found herself thrust into in the pages of Without a Doubt, which Parade magazine reported became her first bestseller. And in the decades since the case's conclusion, The Hollywood Reporter observed that she's become admired and even lionized, adding as importantly of her future career in noveling that she rediscovered some sort of joie de vivre through writing. Channeling her years in the DA's office into the character as Special Trials Prosecutor Rachel Knight, the Daily Beast raved within her fiction debut, Guilt by Association, that she takes us inside the legal world of Los Angeles in her exciting first novel, combining great storytelling with her expert knowledge of the Los Angeles legal system. Clark crafts a thrilling debut, and readers agreed, with book lists congratulating it as a remarkably accomplished debut, with the Midwest Book Review concurring via its own conclusion that this deftly crafted suspense thriller from first page to last demonstrates the author has truly impressive talents as a storyteller, while Suspense magazine correctly predicted that fans will be begging for the Brinkman crew to gear up for their next case, which arrived with Moral Defense, which Crime Spree magazine called riveting and suspenseful, and the Associated Press promise has it all. A hard-charging lawyer heroine, tough-as-nails cops, realistic yet somehow lovable bad guys, as well as a fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants pacing and page-turning twists. Along with successful sequels, Snap Judgment and Final Judgment, with the criminal element assuring readers that she's in fine form. CrimeReads.com found Clark's first standalone fiction work, The Fall Girl, to reflect a savvy hand with the dramas of prosecutorial life and the knack for drawing sharp, interesting characters, and returns with Trial by Ambush, Murder and Justice, and the truth about the case of Barbara Graham. And she's here today to talk all about her one-of-a-kind journey in literature. Marcia, welcome to the show. Growing up, we understand you were drawn to suspense and mystery early as a reader, which doesn't seem like a big leap, given the style and novel that you write today.
Yeah, I really did. I always loved mysteries, murder mysteries, and that, started when I was really young. Nancy Drew was, my first hero. And then after reading her for a few years, I discovered it was a bit formulaic. Like every time her father went out of town, something dropped in her lap, and she showered and changed in every chapter. I thought, this woman has OCD. There's something wrong with her. So, that kind of distracted me. And so I moved on to other authors, but I never stopped being fascinated and obsessed with crime, with fiction, as well as true crime. And so, of course, when I went to law school, it didn't take but 2 months in my first year of law school to know that it was going to be criminal law and nothing else.
So the world needs no introduction to your storied legal career. After you graduated with your bachelor's from UCLA, you then earned your JD at Southwestern University Law School, then worked as a public defender before becoming a prosecutor in the LA County District Attorney's Office in 1981. Whereafter, as The Guardian reported, you were a highly principled and successful prosecutor, winning 19 of 20 murder trials, leading up to the OJ Simpson murder trial, where, as they point out, Clark became, as the New York Magazine put it, the most famous prosecutor in American history. While I promise we have little interest in revisiting a topic you probably grew tired of talking about decades ago, one curiosity we did have was on how distracting or not the constant presence of the camera in the courtroom would be while trying such a blood-curdling case.
It's absolutely true that when a woman is involved in a high-profile situation, whatever that might be, and it's not a place a woman is usually seen, there's a lot of attention. What was odd to me at the time, and to be honest with you, Jake, I really didn't pay attention to it. I blocked it out as much as possible, sometimes to my detriment, because I would forget that there was a camera. The camera was never visible. That what people don't know. The camera was hidden behind a wall that was above and behind the jury box. So it was easy to forget that there was a camera there, especially when there was no jury there. So what you could hide when there was no jury and you could turn around and whatever, say something over your shoulder to someone, was going to get picked up by a camera, but you're not used to having a camera there. So I talk about that in the book. You can read the book and see it. It's not that stunning. Part of the issue, of course, was that the technology had reached that point where they could be 24/7 on camera and, and stream and whatever they were doing back then, but they had that kind of constant coverage, which they never had before. So nobody had a chance to see what was really going on in the courtrooms. And it really wasn't as remarkable as it was portrayed at the time.
Once that case was done, how early did you start considering writing about what became the entire whirlwind, and without a doubt?
It wasn't a serious consideration until after the trial. I had never had a writing assignment before. I was a lawyer, so my writing assignments were motions. It's different. But I didn't, it was a misery, honestly, Jake. I didn't want to, and yet I felt I had to. And thank goodness I had a collaborator who was a wonderful writer, Pulitzer Prize winning author, Teresa Carpenter, who was just a joy. It was a miserable thing because I didn't want to relive it all. At the same time, I thought I had better write it down. I will forget because I'll want to forget. And it's important for people to know the truth about what happened, at least from my point of view. And especially because the case did resonate in terms of so many issues that were important, that still matter today. So I wanted to ensure that I did that, and as hard as it was, as miserable as it was, I had a fantastic collaborator. She would have me write through each chapter. She arced it out. I got to see her do that. That was really a great experience in terms of learning how to arc out a story, as you know. And so she would say, okay, now write about this. And so I would write and then send it into her, and then she'd send it back for comments or edits or whatever. And it was like, what's that, weaving straw into gold? I'd send her straw and it would come back gold. It was amazing to see what she could do. That was a learning process too. And so, it was, yes, a learning process for me as a writer, but most importantly, it was my chance to memorialize what happened at a point in time when I could still remember and wanted to still remember, sort of, I guess. What was interesting to me was how surprised people were. Oh, a woman is the lead prosecutor in the case. But that was not an unusual thing at all. Many women had been lead prosecutors in big cases in the DA's office at that time, before that time. So it was really, it's just that they didn't know.
The Los Angeles Times would draw attention within their coverage of the trial to the make or break presentation point that trial lawyers are storytellers. Perhaps that's why legal thrillers are perpetually popular reading and why so many other authors have worked in the courtroom. The narrative responsibilities differ depending on what side of the bench you're on too, as was on display in both of your compelling opening and closing arguments. How do you see the trial lawyer's responsibility in that role? And how do you feel that well-honed skill aided you by the time you decided to sit down and first give crime fiction writing a shot?
When you put together a case for trial, you want to do it in a way that's both compelling, but also understandable. And so you try to have a logical flow to your witnesses so that the story unfolds in a way that the jury can follow and hang on to. You can't always do that. Some witnesses are not available till later in the case. Some witnesses are not available at all. You have to do a lot of bobbing and weaving to make it happen. So there's definitely that consideration. And then, there's always the effort to make sure you go out on some kind of compelling note at the end of every day. And certainly at the end of the week before the jury goes home for the weekend, you want them to go home thinking about the last salvo you fired. So there's all kinds of dramatic considerations for sure in putting together a trial. And so I do think that matters. I think that probably does help. But the sheer organization of the information that you're giving the jury is something that certainly did help with writing a book, because you lay out your, chapter by chapter, how the story's going to unfold. And you want to do it in a way that's dramatic, of course, and entertaining, but also in a way that's also understandable. So the readers aren't getting bogged down in unnecessary detail or confusing detail. All of these things are certainly helpful. By the time I seriously thought about writing crime fiction, it was later in life.
National Public Radio mused 15 years after you'd left the district attorney's office that she's still hip deep in crime, but from a different perspective, as Los Angeles Magazine excitedly announced that there's a new voice in LA crime fiction. And indeed, as word hit the newswires that you'd be publishing your first fiction novel, People Magazine introduced your heroine, Rachel Knight, as brainy and resolute, before importantly noting that the shop talk here has more panache than its real-life version, as Knight and her buddies, a fellow prosecutor and an LA detective, play the angles to clear a colleague suspected of a murder-suicide. Clark's plot is gritty and intriguing, but it's the hilariously potty-mouthed characters that make this debut thrill sing. What first made Rachel do so in your imagination when you sat down to begin crafting Guilt by Association?
I do. Rachel Knight was the first series that I wrote, and she was a prosecutor, and her best friends, one was a detective and one was another prosecutor. And she was somebody who did understand where defendants were coming from, the harder side of life, but also was certainly somebody who wanted to see the guilty convicted. In Rachel Knight, it was really an effort to remember and relive the times in the DA's office when pre-Simpson, when I could just be a regular prosecutor, no cameras, no lights, no, very little in the way of media attention at all. And you just get to do your job. And you have the camaraderie of other DAs and detectives and, just doing the work. And it was an effort and it was my joy to be able to go back and relive that and explore the memories of what that was like. So in that sense, it was kind of cathartic to get to go back and remember why I loved the job and why I joined the DA's office to begin with.
Once you were part of the club, so to speak, you had some pretty welcoming endorsements from legends like James Ellroy, who raved at your first release that you must read this book. It's wildly and complexly plotted, ebulliently witty, and filled with riotous humor. It details the inner workings of the LA legal system with an unprecedented accuracy and verve. And to top it all off, it's a damn good thriller. What were any favorites among yours of becoming a fiction novelist?
First of all, let me just say, James Patterson was one of my faves. I read a bunch of his books, loved his stuff. So I'm a fan of his. And at that point, I remember meeting one of my heroes, which was James Ellroy. What a fantastic writer. Yeah, he's just amazing. So that was a high point for me. And at that point, I had written my first novel. And that just the ability to meet him. Walter Mosley, I got to meet him, another hero of mine, at a book festival, which was just a thrill. But it happened, it kind of was already happening. I was already writing by the time I met them. That said, it still felt really good to be able to meet your writing heroes, people that I only knew from a book cover before. That was pretty cool.
Throughout the hit sequels that followed over Guilt by Degrees, Killer Ambition, and The Competition, The Guardian observed that you cleverly and consciously made the decision to create tenacious, supportive female characters, with a central trio comprising Knight, fellow lawyer Tony LaCollette, and Detective Bailey Keller. Knight makes a compelling protagonist, rebellious, straightforward, and salty. Please introduce fans who haven't met them yet, or who have favorites, to any supporting cast members you populated Rachel Knight's world with that you especially looked forward to spending time with on the page, book in and out. And what the American Library Association saluted as a superlative series, bringing together both elements of police procedurals and legal thrillers.
They were amalgamations. They were kind of a mix of the people that I knew. Bailey was the detective, and she was an amazing detective, but she kind of was a mix of the detectives that I knew. And Tony was a mix of other DAs that I had known. Tony was her bestie. And then you have the characters that become kind of her informal investigators, like the gang member who was, he was the shot caller of the gang, so to speak. And so Rachel has a very interesting relationship with him, but he's very helpful to her. So yeah, they were all representative of experiences that I'd had as a DA. I had been involved in working on television shows, writing scripts, and it was fun to be able to pull on the characters that I had met and worked with, and it was a different thing to be able to inject into the series. By the time I got to The Competition, I was done with that side of things. I think that I had revisited all of my memories of the DA's office that I needed to.
After having sat across the courtroom from so many killers over the years, from OJ Simpson, whose guilt is pretty well indisputable after he confessed to it on live TV with Judith Reagan in 2007 as part of his twisted If I Did It book promotion, to Robert John Barta, who you also convicted, among others. How did being in the presence of evil help translate that into authentic antagonists on the page in your fiction series?
There are those you can understand their motive, and then there are those that you never will. A serial killer is not someone whose motive is going to make sense, no matter how you try. And I gave up trying with the very first one that I handled. Um, there's, in my opinion, they're simply miswired. And I'm not saying that nature nurture. I'm not saying that they necessarily didn't have a rough life or suffered abuse or neglect. But then you look at so many others who suffered abuse and neglect and were never killers, let alone torturous serial killers. So you have to consider that there's DNA that plays a part in it. The hard wiring plays a part in it. You're not going to waste time thinking about the motive in that case, but in everyone else. And the serial killers are a very small, tiny fraction. It's rare to come up against any of them. And I've only handled a few in my career as both a defense attorney and a prosecutor. So that should tell you something, because I've handled thousands of cases. The rest of them, you can understand, you know why they did it. It's not saying that they should have killed, that it's an excuse that you understand. It means that I understand why they thought they had to kill. And for the most part, they tend to be impulsive. A lot of the murders that you handle, are impulsive killings, either because of rivalry, especially with gangs, or because it's in the course of a robbery, and these things are very seldom thought out. The hitman who carefully assembles his weapons and then lies in wait, that's a very rare thing. So the motive may be ridiculous, but you do understand it. You sit in the courtroom with these defendants, and I don't know that we are not at the front line. I'm not out there chasing them down in the street. By the time they come into the courtroom with me, there's bailiffs, there's a lead investigator sitting next to me. I'm not worried about my safety. I'm just worried about and focused on presenting the evidence to the jury. So I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the defendant's feelings, if you will.
Did you feel like you had to once you began noveling, either in writing from a villain's point of view, or even in portraying your next series star, defense attorney Samantha Brinkman, once you began writing from that side of the courtroom, so to speak?
Yes, and especially with the Samantha Brinkman series, because she is a defense attorney. And she has feelings about her clients, some of whom she feels very sympathetic towards, some of them less so. Samantha has her own system of justice, but she winds up actually hiring one of her clients who was a thief. And he's a fantastic private investigator, really a brilliant guy. And she could see the good in him, and she could see that he was a thief for reasons that are understandable to all of us, under dire circumstances from his family situation, et cetera, et cetera. And that starts with blood defense. You can see that, that's the beginning of her relationship with him. And he's a cool character. So definitely in those books, I go and get into the mindset of what some defendants are like, what other defendants are like. And it can be sympathetic, sometimes not. But for sure, when you write that kind of book where you have a defense attorney getting into it with her clients, you're going to have to explore their motives and their mindset. And I do. And then it really did help that I had been a defense attorney, that I am a defense attorney now. And I do know pretty much understand where they're coming from in many instances, not all, but many. It was a weird thing. I was thinking about what would my next book be, and then I stopped thinking about it and wasn't thinking about it at all when Samantha just popped into my head. I had been thinking about other characters and other setups, a juror. I had thought about a crime victim. I had thought about everything but a defense attorney. And then Sam popped into my head saying, "What about me?" I mean, it was literally like that. And okay. Yes, ma'am. Yes, queen. And so that was it. And her world just kind of naturally flowed from who she was. the fraught relationship with her father, the very fraught relationship with her mother. She's got quite a complicated background. It all just kind of came together. Um, After just seeing her, I knew that this was somebody who'd been through stuff. I had been at that time fascinated by the Columbine case, the shooting, and wanted to explore that in greater depth and how and why of it, and imagined in my mind, what would happen if shooters decided that they were going to take this on as their way to compete and beat the Columbine killers. That always seemed like a scary possibility to me. And so in part we write what we love, but in part we write what we're afraid of. And my kids were younger then and close to high school age. And so it was something that terrified me. So I had to write about it.
You gave crime fiction readers, especially those illegal dramas, precisely what they were after here than blood defense. The Associated Press validating that you clearly knew this world well. Clark has the most fun when she's showing readers the world of celebrity trials, from the media circus to the courthouse crowds, the crazies, and the police to the inner workings of the trial itself, before predicting that you'll push yourself to finish the final pages, just to keep pace with the defense team's discoveries, while Elle magazine promised fans would be thrilled with sequel Moral Defense, in which your assumptions as to whodunit will be wrong. The book has a complicated moral compass, and with the big thrill observed that, as is the case with all Clark novels, this is a page-turning journey, alongside Snap Judgment and Final Judgment proving equally popular with readers. What do you feel it was, looking back, about Samantha Brinkman's character that made so many want to see the world from her point of view in the course of this series?
A prosecutor has an awesome obligation, as I said, to ensure that justice is served, to make sure the defendant gets a fair trial, to make sure the defendant is convicted of actually what he did and nothing more. So there's all these bigger obligations to being a prosecutor. A defense attorney gets to poke holes in the case. Take shots, at all the witnesses, at the evidence, at the police work. That's their job, and so they can play a little bit more fast and loose, if you will, and also not worry about the overarching justice and fairness of the trial. Not a defense attorney's concern. So you can be kind of the hired gun, if you will, and you come in as a gunslinger and you just, you constantly swing for the fences on behalf of your clients. That's your job. So it is kind of fun. And then, of course, you're hanging around with all these characters who are your clients. I think it's in Blood Defense that Samantha's walking from an appearance on a cable news show where she's been a talking head, and somebody starts to jack her up, tries to rob her, and it turns out to be her client. And she's like, oh, really? It's really fun to be able to write scenes like that. As far as the mindset, it's different for a prosecutor. And this is where I will get up on my soapbox just for a moment and say, it would be really, really good if criminal lawyers were required to step into the other side's shoes for a minute before it's like, you want to be in private practice and you want to be a defense attorney and you want to be a famous defense attorney, let's say, and handle high profile cases. Good for you. But try being a prosecutor for a minute and see the case from the victim's point of view, for the harrowing effects of the crime that's been committed and what it does to the family and what it does to the defendant. What it does to the victims, so that you can get a sense of what it's like to be on that side of things, and then go defend your defendants. I'm not saying you don't fight go to the wall for them. You do, but it really helps your understanding of the fullness of your job and what all of it entails and the repercussions of what you do if you are standing on both sides. That said, I would say the same for prosecutors. It would be really a good thing for prosecutors to always have to defend for a while. Spend a year being a defense attorney and seeing why defendants wind up in the situations that they do, why they did what they did, and understand, you appreciate the nuance of what is going on and why they came to the place in their lives where they did what they did. It all helps. And I think that understanding as many points of view as possible, getting the full picture, is really important to especially for a prosecutor, I must say, whose job it is to ensure that justice is served, not just that a defendant gets convicted. It's important. A prosecutor has to make sure the trial is fair. It's not just getting a notch in the belt. Defense attorney is a different story. You know, they only have to defend their client. So I'm a big advocate for everybody should stand in somebody else's shoes, walk a mile in their shoes, and to understand what their job really means and have a depth of understanding of that. So from a prosecutor's point of view, who has never been a defense attorney, you don't think much about the defendant other than very, very, very many prosecutors. He's a scumbag, you know, he's just a scumbag and I'm going to put him away, or her more rarely. And so that's too bad because, you know, you can miss a lot of important aspects of the case by doing that. From the defense point of view, I think defense attorneys, they can probably be a little bit more myopic in focusing only on their client, but they have a tendency to also get the victim's side of it, because how can you not, right? I mean, when your client has killed someone, it's really hard not to understand that there's a great deal of suffering on the other side, even if you understand why your client did it. So I think that a defense attorney has to be very careful not to be cavalier about what the client has done, and it's a fine line to walk in order to not turn the jury off. So you have to, you know, appreciate what everybody's role in this was and what everybody has gone through. Prosecutors should do that too. Some do. I have not given up on writing Samantha. I still think that I might go back to her because there's much more to say about her life and where she's at.
You'd next turn to your first standalone within writing The Fall Girl, where crime reads admired that as a consistent theme throughout all of your art imitating life writing. Clark is a savvy hand with the dramas of prosecutorial life and a knack for drawing sharp, interesting characters. What made you head with this new series for Santa Clara as a new backdrop for the district attorney's office, that Charlie Blair, Erica Lorman, and others work, and that the case takes place in?
I wanted to try my hand at something that would not be continuing and burn my bridge, so to speak, so that it ends at the end of that book. This is not to say I didn't enjoy writing series, I really did, but I wanted to, you know, do something different. And so it was very different because in The Fall Girl, I took two different points of view. So we have alternating chapters between two prosecutors who are trying a high profile case, one of whom has something to hide. The other of whom also has her own things to hide, but they're different things. And they're trying to suss each other out. So there's kind of a cat and mouse going on between them. California is really kind of amazing this way. And that's why it's fun to be able to write from this perspective, because every part of California is different. You go up north and you have a certain kind of ethos and a certain kind of society and culture. You go down south and you have, you know, down in Riverside, down in the border towns even, you have a different one. And then you go to the Imperial Valley and you have yet a different one. Los Angeles is a different one. It's amazing to me. It's like so many different states in one state. So I wanted to try a different location because I'd really based everything in Los Angeles up until then. And Santa Cruz is a smaller town that's a really interesting place because it is a coastal town. It has its beauty in the redwood forest, but it also has seedy sides too. So it's not glitz and glamour all the way. It also happens to be where they filmed The Lost Boys, which is a big favorite film of mine. It's such a good one. I think I've watched it 15 times. It was really fun to be able to explore the different location, if you will, and how that impacted the way that everybody had to work and how they picked a jury, and, you know, just the way the location impacted the feeling of the book and the feeling of the characters.
As a child of the 80s, I had that movie poster hanging on my bedroom wall for years. Killer film. So within writing any of these stories, you've interviewed and cross-examined so many witnesses throughout your career that must lend itself beautifully to crafting believable dialogue within any fiction work you happen to be penning in the legal arena, from courtroom scenes to negotiations to conversations between lawyers and beyond.
I love writing dialogue. It's my favorite thing. I think that's why I loved script writing so much. It's just so much fun. So when it comes to courtroom scenes, it does help that I know how that goes. So I know how a prosecutor will do direct examination of a witness, how a defense attorney will do cross examination of the witness, and what closing arguments are like. But that said, courtroom scenes, less is more usually. unless you have a dramatic moment to deliver. And there aren't that many that are believably going to be in one case. Although my most recent case kind of proved that wrong, but we'll talk about that in a second. Um, but I have to say, I don't typically in my novels spend a lot of time in court because it's not usually that much fun. And I don't want to take the reader out of the moment with scenes in a courtroom that would never happen. It makes no sense. People know too much and have seen too many law shows to think that you can fudge and mess around and have fireworks endlessly happening in a courtroom and have it be believable. So I think readers are pretty discerning that way. So I save a lot of my dialogue for outside the courtroom, which is really where the action happens. I mean, that's really where all the big stuff is going to go on. And that's where you can really have fun with your characters giving each other a hard time or confiding in each other or, whatever it might be. Courtroom experience certainly does prepare you for speaking extemporaneously because so much of what happens in court cannot be anticipated. You can prepare to the ends of the earth. And I tried to. I really do believe in the maxim that you have to go into the courtroom knowing more than anyone else about your case. I think Leslie Abramson said that. She's a great lawyer. So you can prepare and you think you know everything a witness is going to say, or you try to. But you have to be aware that witnesses are going to say things you don't anticipate. Defense attorneys are going to make objections to things that make no sense or do make sense and you didn't think of it. The judge is going to make rulings that may or may not make sense. You have to roll with these punches and you have to be able to think quickly on your feet and you have to respond in a way that takes a lot of considerations, a lot of things into consideration. And something that is really difficult during trial is to think about whether to object. Sometimes the best move you make is a move you don't make, is you don't object. You allow the defense to go into an area where, hey, that's good for me. I'm not going to object. I'm not going to turn off that faucet. I want to jump in with that. So you have to think minute by minute, second by second, object, don't object, speak, don't speak, ask this question, don't ask this question, that kind of thing. I think that does prepare you for speaking spontaneously and responding when you're on the air. To what degree does that help writing dialogue? I guess everything does, right? Every experience that you have, whether it's on camera, whether it's in a courtroom, you're observing others and you're listening as well as speaking. And so all of that must filter in somewhere, I think.
Parade magazine, within their coverage of Trial by Ambush, Murder, Injustice, and the Truth About the Case of Barbara Graham, wrote that Marcia Clark felt she had to tell this particular story of the criminal case and scandalous trial of Barbara Graham in the 1950s, where the trial coverage painted Graham as a female fatale. But only a few years later, Susan Hayward won an Oscar playing Graham as a near innocent in the acclaimed hit film I Want to Live. Then Clark saw a photograph of Graham in the trial itself. Reporters and photographers swarmed around her like vultures on a corpse. Clark was riveted. Then she got lucky because though the case was around 70 years ago, all the court records have been preserved. And as always happens, the details that emerged grew more and more fascinating. So she knew she had her new book, a work of true crime. But before the photo, before the treasure troves of court documents, before the Oscar-winning film, there was the crime itself. And a better introduction we couldn't give the facts of this case. Please, as you presented your examination and interpretation on the page, elaborate on what initially intrigued you about Barbara Graham, notably the last woman executed in California, and what you discovered within your own reading of the trial transcripts, police records, and more, that moved you to conclude throughout your writing journey, as your title implies, that an injustice had in fact occurred.
It was really exciting and fascinating to jump into someone else's case and read it from the perspective of what really happened here? Why did it end up the way it did? Because to me, that was the biggest mystery. I had never heard of Barbara Graham. And it was an accident that I even found her because I was looking at a different case. I was looking at another woman who had been the last one to be executed in California. Barbara Graham was the one before that. And just happened to bump into her. And then I saw that the case was famous. It was like their trial of the century. It wound up becoming a film called I Want to Live that won an Oscar for Best Actress for Susan Hayward. So I thought, oh God, everybody's written about this, forget it. But I thought, let me look, let me just see. It turned out they hadn't. There was plenty of coverage from back in the day. if you know about newspapers.com, you know the hell that I went through in trying to find and refind articles. It's got a weird search engine that you can find an article one day and not the next. That was crazy making. But it provided me with a wealth of information in terms of the trial, but it was not terribly reliable because they were so tabloid oriented, so sensationalized that each one was trying to top the other one in terms of clickbait about the trial. So I said, I'll never know the truth of the case unless I get the trial transcripts. And that was its whole journey in and of itself because it's a 70-year-old case. But I wound up getting everything, the clerk's transcript, as well as the reporter's transcripts, all 4,000 plus pages of them. In addition to that, I also managed to get a copy of Walter Wanger, the producer of the film, his archives. He kept an archive of all the paperwork that went through his hands, including Barbara's letters to her lawyers, a report prepared by her private investigator after her conviction, which was critical information no one ever saw. The first statement given by the accomplice who was the star witness for the prosecution that no one ever saw, that the prosecution illegally buried and did not show the defense. There was a lot of malfeasance in this case, a lot of unethical conduct in this case that never had come to light. And it was truly shocking as I read through the transcript and saw the moves that they were making. Now, some of the stuff they did that I objected to and that was very upsetting to me was legal back then, became legal shortly thereafter in the years following. But nevertheless, was pushing the envelope, and they went after Barbara. It was Barbara and three men who committed this. It was a robbery, home invasion robbery, in which the victim, who was an elderly woman, was brutally pistol whipped and strangled to death. And they tore up the house, blood on the walls, carpets ripped up, furniture upturned. It was crazy. And they were searching for what they believed they would find, a safe with hundreds of thousands of dollars, which turned out to be not true. But there's a connection there to a casino operator and real estate entrepreneur named Tudor Scherer. It had been his house, which he gave to his ex-wife, Mabel, the victim's mother. He remained close with her, and he came to visit her often, which led to rumors in the crime community of Los Angeles that because he was visiting Mabel Monahan, it must be for a purpose, and that purpose must be to hide money that he was making from his casino. Wasn't true. Never was true. So it was Barbara on trial with these two thugs that were obviously who they were. These guys were mass murderers, and it came to light during the trial that they were suspected of committing heinous murders up north of a minor in Gold Country, as well as a man and three children who were stuffed in the trunk of their car. Just hideous. Barbara, on the other hand, had priors that were typical of the unskilled person who has no way of making a living. She had misdemeanors in her background, only nonviolent misdemeanors, check kiting, shoplifting, prostitution, that sort of thing. But she was also very beautiful, so she could get married, and she did frequently. But she was also somebody who, considering that she had no prior education to speak of, very smart, very intelligent, very sensitive. She was a fan of jazz music, classical music, read Omar Khayyam, was an amazing person who kept trying to get a foothold in legit society and never could quite make it. And she had a mother who made sure she never would make it. So all of the odds were stacked against her. But the newspapers went crazy because here's this woman in the 1950s who's beautiful and they called her, looks more like a showgirl than a defendant, and yet is accused of this heinous crime. And the star witness for the prosecution made sure to frame her up as the one who pistol whipped the victim. And as you'll see in the book, I explain why his story was so inherently unbelievable, as I call him. His name was actually John True. I call him the ironically named John True. So the prosecution, though, went after her with an unholy zeal that was so over the top that even a federal judge at that time found it unseemly. So it felt to me like they were trying to get a notch in their belt, because it's easy to convict the two men sitting next to her. Very hard to convict a woman who looked like that. And they pulled out all the stops to do it and chase her into the gas chamber. I took a story approach. I took a fiction, the way we map out a novel. I did it like that, and I tried to keep it chronological. So you start with the night of the murder, and you move forward you go through the case and then the discovery, the investigation, and then the effort to find out who done it, because they had no witnesses, they had no physical evidence, they had nothing. The only thing they could hope to do is tap all their informants on the street to see if there was word on the street about who might have been involved. And ultimately, that is what broke the case. And then what the police did with that and how, so you move forward through it and then into the trial. So I take steps to the side to add the information that the jury never saw, making clear to the reader the jury didn't know, but here's what was going on at the time. So at the end of it, I could say to the reader, you now know more than the jury ever did. And if the jury had known what you know, I don't think Barbara would ever have gone to the gas chamber. So I do take a narrative position. I do focus on it like I did with any of the fiction that I wrote.
How unusual was it for a woman to be put to death back when California had a death penalty that they actually enforced?
There were only 4. And the last one was in 61, I think. And I think something like that. That's it. And there hasn't been any since. And California now has a moratorium. And so I don't think we've had an execution in this state in decades.
Now that you're in the midst of your 4th decade as an author, does true crime continue to interest you as a new path to keep writing narrative fiction down? And are there any cases you're looking into now you can enlighten us to that might show up on the page in future examinations?
I would like to. I think writing about true crime is really fascinating. This one was fascinating. What I need to do is find another case, and this is no easy thing, but I don't want to just talk about the evil blood dripping off his fangs monster. I don't care about that sort of slasher stuff. I'm not in this to write about blood and gore and shock and titillate. If there's no deeper issue to talk about, no issue about justice, about truth, about our society, our culture, then there's no point. So it would have to be a case that offers reason to talk about larger issues, not just the fascination of some heinous crime, which I think really we're at the point now where we've done so much of that. It wouldn't be interesting to anyone. I think there has to be some kind of character and cultural issue involved to make it compelling. Right now, I'm looking for the next case in terms of a true crime book. That's my focus.
Writing Within Hollywood tapped a whole different side of your experiential and creative mind infusion. Big hit TV and streaming series like Pretty Little Liars, Borderland, The Fix, and Guilt by Association, among others. How have you found creating in that world to resemble and also differ from writing within that of novels?
It was really fun. Script writing is a fun thing. It's its own genre unto itself, and there's a lot to learn and a lot to know about it. And it was doing courtroom scenes again. It was the same situation that I felt in the novels that I've written. A little bit goes a very long way, and so you deliver the crash bang pow. In a few short scenes. You don't want to spend a lot of time with lawyers yammering at each other, but it's really fun to be able to move people around in a courtroom and.
You have a podcast that you hosted amid everything else you've been working on the last few years. What did you find to be most entertaining about storytelling on that platform?
I did a podcast for Wondery that is now up, and you can find it there. It's called Informants Lawyer X, and it focuses on a woman, a lawyer who was very high profile, high power criminal lawyer, defending the drug lords and gangsters at the top of their game in Melbourne, Australia, during an era called the Gangland Wars, when drugs were proliferating, meth, ecstasy, and bodies were literally dropping in the streets of this beautiful city, Melbourne, that, Melbourne never had that kind of crime ever. And suddenly these criminals were, very violent criminals were literally, the streets were became a dangerous place because of it. She was defending them all until she became, and continued to defend them as she became, the most prolific informant that the police had ever had. So while she was defending these big time gangsters, she was informing on them to the police. And it's the craziest story with the most breakneck turns and twists I've ever seen. And even writing it, and myself, as I'm saying it, as I'm actually saying it to the audience and going through it again, I'm thinking, oh my God, whoa, this is crazy. So anyway, it's on Wondery and I think Wondery Plus, so you can check it out. Informants, Lawyer X. It's up now.
Finally, before we run, as a storyteller who's found success doing so across more mediums than most would in a lifetime, what advice did you give to young prosecutors back in your DA days and since in conversations with book authors that have served you well applying this art form as successfully as you have over the past 50 years?
People say write what you know. I say write what you love. So if the two go together, you've got an easier ride, but writing what you love is going to keep you writing. And you just have to make yourself do it. The other rule is do it every day. Even if it's only for a few minutes, do it every day. And don't hate on what you do. If you are writing, if it's garbage, you look at it the next day and you'll fix it. Whatever it might be, it can be fixed and it can be redone, but do it every day and you'll wind up with a book.
Marcia, it has been an experience talking today. We thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's been a pleasure.